Forget nuclear missiles or ground invasions. The single greatest threat to the United States right now is completely invisible, and if triggered, it could cause an economic collapse worse than the 2008 financial crisis. What if I told you that Apple, Tesla, Nvidia, and the entire US military-industrial complex could be completely paralyzed by cutting off a single obscure gas from the Middle East? Today, we expose the ultimate geopolitical trap: how Washington's greatest adversaries have quietly figured out how to shut down the global semiconductor industry without firing a single shot, and why the next global war won't be fought over territory, but over the hidden supply chains that hold the modern world together. There's a scenario unfolding right now that almost nobody in mainstream media is talking about clearly. It doesn't involve a nuclear bomb. It doesn't involve a ground invasion. It doesn't even involve a direct attack on American soil. And yet, if this plays out the way strategists are now warning, it could trigger the single largest economic shock the United States has faced since the 2008 financial crisis, maybe bigger. This is the story of how a conflict thousands of miles away could quietly shut down Apple, freeze Nvidia, halt Tesla's production lines, and push the American economy to the edge through something most people have never even thought about. Welcome to Daily Reports, where you get clear, reliable, and up-to-date coverage of global events. Let's establish the foundation first, because this story only makes sense when you understand the architecture of the global economy. The modern world runs on semiconductors, chips, the tiny, almost invisible components inside your iPhone, your laptop, your car, your refrigerator, the fighter jets protecting your country, the data centers powering artificial intelligence. Everything. And here's a fact that most people in the West have simply never had to confront. Because things have worked smoothly for so long, we stopped paying attention to the machinery underneath. Taiwan manufactures approximately 70% of the world's semiconductors. And when it comes to the most advanced chips, the kind that power AI systems, next-generation military technology, and high-end consumer electronics, Taiwan's share rises to around 90%. That's not a statistic. That's a choke point. One island, one supply chain, one single point of failure for the entire technological infrastructure of the modern world. Now, here's where the story gets complicated and dangerous. Taiwan's semiconductor industry doesn't run on silicon alone. It runs on a gas that most people have never thought about once in their lives. Helium, not the kind you put in birthday balloons. Industrial-grade helium, ultra-purified, processed to extraordinary precision, is essential to chip manufacturing. It's used to cool equipment to create the controlled contamination-free environments that allow chips to be fabricated at nanometer scales. Without helium, the machines stop. Without the machines, the chips stop. Without the chips, well, we'll get to that. Now, here's the critical question. Where does Taiwan's helium come from? A significant portion of Taiwan's helium supply, alongside its liquefied natural gas, flows from one source, Qatar. Qatar sits atop one of the largest natural gas reserves on the planet, and helium critically is extracted as a byproduct of natural gas processing. You pull the gas out of the ground, separate it, refine it, and along with the LNG, you get helium. Qatar has become one of the world's most important helium exporters, and Taiwan has become one of its most important customers. Now, draw a straight line between these two facts, and then ask yourself one question. What happens to Taiwan's chip factories if cars' LG and helium supply is suddenly disrupted? That is exactly the question that certain strategic planners in Thrawn, Beijing, and Moscow appear to have been asking for years. This isn't about missiles hitting American cities. That's not how 21st century warfare between major powers actually works. Modern great power conflict, the kind being studied in war colleges, think tanks, and intelligence agencies across Washington, London, and Brussels, is increasingly about systems, leverage, pressure points, the invisible threads that hold the global economy together. And Iran, whatever you think of its government, has been studying those threads carefully for decades. The strategic logic here is almost elegant in its ruthlessness. If a conflict escalates to the point where Qatar's energy infrastructure becomes a target, whether through direct strikes, through the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, or through any number of escalation scenarios, the consequences don't stay in the Middle East. They travel fast along those invisible supply chain threads directly into the boardrooms of Silicon Valley. Think about what we're actually describing here. Taiwan's semiconductor fabrication facilities require a continuous, reliable supply of helium. These aren't stockpile operations with months of reserve inventory sitting in warehouses. The supply chains are lean, optimized for efficiency, not resilience. That's how the global economy has been built for 30 years. Just in time, lowest cost, maximum efficiency. It works beautifully right up until the moment it doesn't. If guitar supply becomes unavailable, even for weeks, Taiwan's manufacturers face a brutal choice: ration what they have and slow production dramatically, or shut down certain operations entirely. And when Taiwan's chip output drops, the shockwave doesn't take long to reach every major economy on Earth. Let's walk through exactly what happens step by step, because the cause and effect chain here is both precise and devastating. Step 1. The supply disruption hits Taiwan. Helium inventories begin declining. Fabrication facilities start rationing. Production throughput drops. The most advanced chip manufacturing, the kind that requires the most stringent atmospheric controls, gets hit first and hardest. Taiwan's manufacturers send notices to their customers. The messages are polite, professional, and alarming. We cannot maintain current delivery schedules. We do not have visibility on when normal supply will resume. Step 2. The notices land on desks in Certino, Austin, and Detroit. Apple, Nvidia, Qualcomm, Intel, Tesla, Ford, General Motors. These companies don't manufacture their own advanced chips. They design them, but they rely on Taiwan, specifically on companies like TSMC, to actually produce them. Apple's iPhone lineup depends entirely on chips fabricated in Taiwan. The A-series and M-series processors that power every Apple device gone. Nvidia's data center chips, the ones powering the AI revolution that every major tech company, every government, every hedge fund is currently racing to deploy. Fabricated in Taiwan, gone. Tesla's vehicles are already semiconductor intensive. Electric vehicles use more chips than traditional cars, not fewer. Production lines that were already operating under tight constraints now face something far worse than a shortage. They face a halt. Step 3. The financial markets process what this means. Wall Street doesn't panic immediately. Markets are sophisticated. Investors want information, projections, clarity. But clarity doesn't come because nobody can tell them when the supply chain will normalize. And uncertainty in financial markets is its own form of catastrophe. Tech stocks begin declining. Not crashing yet, but declining steadily as earnings guidance gets revised downward, as production targets get cut. As CFOs begin quietly telling investors that revenue projections from 6 months ago are no longer reliable, the Nasdaq feels it first, then the broader market. Step 4. The employment shock arrives. When production slows, companies respond the way they always do. They cut costs, they freeze hiring, then they begin reducing headcount. The tech sector, which has already seen significant layoffs over the past 2 years, faces a new wave. But this time, it's not driven by overhiring during a pandemic boom. This time, it's driven by a fundamental inability to produce the products that generate revenue. Apple can't ship iPhones at scale. Nvidia can't fulfill data center orders. Tesla can't build cars fast enough to meet demand, even as demand remains strong. The jobs go, tax revenue follows, GDP slows. Step 5. The dollar comes under pressure. This is where the economic analysis gets serious and where strategists in Washington start losing sleep. America runs a significant trade deficit. It imports more than it exports. When the economy is strong, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. This is manageable. But when confidence in American economic stability begins to crack, when investors around the world start asking whether the U.S. can navigate a prolonged supply chain crisis, the calculation changes. Foreign capital begins flowing out of U.S. equities. The dollar weakens. Import costs rise, which means inflation accelerates, which means the Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice between fighting inflation and supporting economic growth. There's a term for this. It's called stagflation. And the last time America experienced it seriously was in the 1970s. It took nearly a decade to escape. Now, Let's step back from the economic mechanics and look at the strategic picture, because this isn't a coincidence. This isn't an accident of geography or history. The pattern emerging from the strategic behavior of Iran, Russia, and China over the past decade points to something more deliberate, more coordinated, more patient. These three governments have studied American power carefully. They understand where America is strong. The U.S. military is extraordinary, the most powerful in human history, by almost any conventional measure. Direct military confrontation with America is for any of these actors off the table. But they've also studied where America is vulnerable, and the answer they've arrived at is the supply chain. America outsourced its manufacturing over 30 years in pursuit of efficiency and lower costs. That decision made the U.S. economy more productive in the short term. It also made it structurally dependent on suppliers in Asia, in the Middle East, in parts of the world where American influence is now actively being challenged. Helium from Qatar, chips from Taiwan, rare earth elements from China, oil from the Gulf. The architecture of the American economy was built for a world of stable globalization. That world is ending, and the adversaries who accelerated its ending, who recognized the leverage embedded in those supply chains and began applying pressure to them strategically, understood something that American policymakers are only now beginning to fully absorb. You don't have to defeat the American military to damage the American economy. You just have to make the supply chain unpredictable enough, long enough to shake investor confidence and trigger a domestic political crisis. That's the real battlefield, not the Strait of Hormuz, the quarterly earnings calls, the investor confidence surveys, the jobs numbers. This is economic warfare, and it's been playing out in slow motion for years. Here's what makes the current situation even more strategically complex for Washington. When American policymakers look around for allies willing to take coordinated action, to escort tankers, to guarantee supply routes, to apply collective pressure, the response from traditional partners has been noticeably cool. European governments already managing their own energy vulnerabilities after the disruption of Russian gas supplies are not eager to enter another conflict that could further destabilize the energy markets they depend on. Gulf states, some of the most important American partners in the region, are navigating their own calculations. These are governments that have long relationships with Washington, but also relationships with Beijing and with Tehran. They are not interested in becoming the next front in someone else's war. Japan and South Korea, both of which are deeply dependent on Taiwanese chips and Qatari LNG for their own economies, are watching the situation carefully, but neither is in a position to project significant military power into a Middle Eastern conflict. And NATO, the alliance that has defined Western collective security for 7 decades, was built to defend Europe. Its appetite for a prolonged military commitment in the Persian Gulf, at a time when the alliance is already stretched by the war in Ukraine, is limited. This is the strategic trap that appears to have been set deliberately, not a military trap, a diplomatic one. Isolate the United States, force Washington to choose between escalating alone with all the costs that entails, or accepting a situation that increasingly favors its adversaries. There is no clean exit from this kind of trap. Every option carries significant costs. Military escalation risks a broader conflict that could make the current supply chain disruption look minor by comparison. Diplomatic negotiation under conditions of obvious pressure risks signaling weakness and inviting further testing. This is what sophisticated strategic pressure looks like in the modern era. It doesn't announce itself dramatically. It tightens gradually until the options narrow. Let's bring this back to what it actually means for ordinary people, because geopolitical strategy has a way of becoming abstract. And the real stakes here are anything but abstract. A family in Michigan buying a car, a nurse in Manchester relying on medical equipment that contains chips fabricated in Taiwan, a small business owner in Toronto whose entire point-of-sale system depends on technology that traces its critical components back to that same supply chain. When production slows, prices rise. That's not theory. It's what happened during the pandemic-era chip shortage. When car prices spiked, when electronics became harder to find, when waiting lists stretched to months, that shortage was manageable. It was caused by demand surges and logistics disruptions, not by a geopolitically motivated disruption of a fundamental input like helium. A helium supply crisis of significant scale would be qualitatively different. It would affect the most advanced segment of chip manufacturing, the the very top of the stack, the chips that can't be easily substituted, the chips that power the most critical systems, defense systems, medical devices, AI infrastructure, financial markets, power grid management. This isn't about whether your next phone upgrade gets delayed by a few months. This is about whether the technological infrastructure of the modern world continues to function reliably. The stakes are that serious. And the communities that feel it first, the manufacturing workers, the tech employees, the small business owners, are exactly the voters and exactly the constituencies that have the most political power in American and British elections. This isn't just an economic story. It's a political one. And the politicians who fail to navigate it will pay a price at the ballot box. So, what are the realistic options for Washington? Because this situation, as serious as it is not without potential responses. Option 1. Accelerate domestic supply chain resilience. This is already happening, but slowly. The CHIPS Act passed in the United States in 2022 was explicitly designed to rebuild domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity. Companies like Intel and TSMC are building new fabrication facilities on American soil, but these facilities take years to build and years more to reach full operational efficiency. They are not a solution to a crisis unfolding now. They are insurance against the next crisis. Option 2, diversify helium supply. The United States is actually one of the world's largest helium producers, a fact that's easy to overlook. American helium reserves in the Federal Helium Reserve System and in private extraction operations represent a significant alternative source. The challenge is logistics. Getting American helium to Taiwanese fabrication facilities reliably, at scale, quickly, that requires coordination, infrastructure, and time, none of which are abundant in a fast-moving crisis. Option 3, engage diplomatically to stabilize the region. The most effective solution to a supply chain crisis caused by geopolitical instability is ultimately geopolitical stability that requires diplomacy. Difficult, unglamorous, patience-intensive diplomacy. But it's worth noting that diplomatic solutions, when they work, tend to be both more durable and less costly than military ones. The question is whether the political will exists in Washington, in allied capitals, in the relevant regional governments to pursue that path seriously under conditions of significant pressure. Option 4, accept short-term pain to force long-term restructuring. Some strategists argue that the most important thing the United States can do is use this crisis as the catalyst for the structural economic changes that policymakers have been slow walking for decades. Rebuild manufacturing, diversify supply chains, reduce single points of failure. This is the right long-term answer. It is not comfortable in the short term. Any political leader who tells you restructuring a global supply chain is painless is not telling you the truth. Here is what the situation actually reveals. The era of frictionless globalization, where cheap, efficient supply chains delivered prosperity across the Western world, while nobody had to think too hard about where anything came from. That era is over. It didn't end because of one attack or one conflict or one crisis. It ended because the underlying assumptions it was built on turned out to be wrong. The assumption that geopolitical rivals would always prefer the benefits of global trade over the leverage of supply chain control. The assumption that efficiency was the only dimension that mattered in economic planning. The assumption that American military superiority would be enough to deter any challenge to the global order that American power had built. All of these assumptions are now being tested simultaneously. And the testing is being done by governments that have studied American power carefully, identified its pressure points precisely, and appear to be applying pressure with considerable patience and coordination. This is not the end of American power. It is a serious challenge to the structures that have supported the power for 30 years. How Washington responds, how quickly it adapts, how honestly it assesses its vulnerabilities, how effectively it rebuilds its resilience will determine not just the outcome of this crisis, but the shape of the global order for the next generation. The chips are down in more ways than one. Before you go, I want to hear from you, because this is exactly the kind of story where your perspective matters. Question 1. Do you think Western governments in the US, UK, and Canada have been too slow to recognize supply chain vulnerability as a genuine national security issue? Or do you think the current response is actually adequate? Question 2. If you had to identify the single most important thing the United States should do right now to protect its economic resilience against this kind of strategic pressure, what would it be? Reshore manufacturing, diversify energy supplies, invest in diplomatic solutions. Drop your answer below. The story we just walked through isn't speculation for its own sake. It's a map of how modern power works through leverage, through systems, through the invisible infrastructure that holds everything together. Understanding that map doesn't guarantee that the right decisions get made, but not understanding it guarantees that they won't. Stay informed, stay clear-eyed, and keep asking the questions that most people aren't asking. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to smash the bell icon so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Take good care of yourselves, and thank you for watching.